Welcome to Allies or Enemies. I'm Jess.
And I am Sean, and today we are talking about Tales of the Twisted Realms, and this is a paid Kickstarter preview, so we aren't really going to be giving our opinions here. We're just going to be talking about the nuts and bolts, how it works. We're going to have a little mini how it plays for each one of these games, and when I say each one of these games, it's because Tales of the Twisted Realms is actually 3 different games that have all been put into this series of games. It's released by Inside Up, the Canadian company Inside Up, who you'd also know from Earth, and they've put together this really interesting Kickstarter.
Yeah, so they all take place in this same world that I think they're building up, but each of the games mechanically plays differently, is done by different designers, and is also different artists. So even though it's the same world, the art representation is different amongst the games. But they are all in these book formats. So we have Thieves of Eldris, which is volume 3.
I did these in reverse order, that's fine.
Tug of Roar, I believe, which is volume 2. And Crits and Tricks, which is volume 1. And so they all look like these different books.
Yes, and I love this with actual books on bookshelves to have a matching set. I appreciate this about the box. So this is what it looks like when we got all these together. And when I say this is what it looks like, it is important to note that everything here is still prototype. This is still an early version of the game. We know just from looking at the Kickstarter page, a lot of this stuff is getting upgraded.
So some of the components are going to change. We know that some of the cardboard tokens are going to be upgraded to be wooden tokens. The cards will still have the metallic shine, but may be upgraded to be PVC cards. But let's start looking at each of the games individually, starting with Volume 1, Crits and Tricks.
You start Crits and Tricks with a screen and a set of 6 dice in your player color, as well as 8 mercenary cards, which will be a mix of the 3 suits you have chosen for this game, as well as the bard. Then, everyone gets 4 quest cards that they will draft and pass until they have 3 left. The quest cards, as well as the central barkeep challenge, are little challenges you need to do to get goods from the middle of the table. Each hand, the lead player will play one of their mercenary cards as well as one of the dice that they have behind their screen, which they can re-roll once if they want. The mercenary card gives you the win condition for this hand, highest, lowest, closest to 5, etc., while the dice becomes the strength of the card you played. You can also further affect things by playing a second card from your hand for its crit ability, which you can only do twice a round. The point of all of this is to try to complete your quests, which often involve you trying to win or lose your tricks in specific ways. Complete the central barkeep challenge, and collect up bards from winning tricks. After 3 rounds or 18 tricks, you count up all of the money you earned, and whoever has the most wins.
So the 2-player game works a little bit differently, and instead of drafting and passing the different quests, you get 6 quests that are laid out, and you're both competing for those quests. So it is interesting that you have 6 available, but it's a race with the other player.
Yeah, so everything is always active, and when you complete them, they're gone. Those quests disappear, so it kind of dwindles as you go. You also aren't going to use the barkeep challenges because these kind of work like those anyway, but instead of having them in your hand, you're competing for everything. And it did actually work, the 2-player game. Usually a trick-taking game, you think 2 players is not going to work at all. It does work.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with, because it's such a different type of trick-playing game, combining the dice with the cards. Because none of the cards actually have a value. And the first time I looked at it, I thought, how are we going to play this trick-taking game? But because you're rolling all of these mix of dice that all have different values and then assigning them, it leads to some interesting decisions about which dice you're going to use with which characters.
And it is interesting too with the dice because of that thematic tie-in too, because everything obviously here is that kind of Dungeons and Dragons feel, and you're getting to roll the entire set of Dungeons and Dragons dice with all of those different values. And I like that when you're putting those on your cards too, you're kind of deciding like you can throw some hands, because sometimes in any trick taking, and including in this one, you do want to lose some of those hands. And so those low dice can be just as helpful as those high dice, especially with some of the different mixes of mercenaries you can have as well, because the 6 different mercenaries all have different wing conditions. Well, 5 of them do. The bards just copy whoever else is around. But 5 of them all have different wing conditions, and that includes having the lowest dice, having the highest dice, having the second highest dice, having the highest dice, but also with the same dice as people played previously, and having the closest to 5, which I think is a really interesting one.
Yeah, we really like playing with the wizard and having the closest to 5. And you always have the option, too, of re-rolling your dice. So once you've selected it, so you might be like, okay, well, I know I can't get it this time, and I really want to. Let me see if my roll changes that. But like you said, you don't necessarily want to win, because it all ties in to the quests that you're getting, either the ones that you drafted or the ones that you're competing for in a 2-player game. That's it. That's how you're earning the points, which is the money. It has nothing to do with winning the tricks, only if winning the tricks also corresponds to winning a quest.
Yes, or if it wins you a bard. You do get a point every
That's true.
time, or $1 every time you have got a bard in your winnings pile. So that is also worth something. But I do like that with the dice, both at the beginning of the trick, you can decide, you know what, I'm going to give it a shot and see if I can do better. Although that can blow up in your face, but also you're always in it with a chance, because even if you've got terrible dice right now, you don't know what you're going to have in the future. So you can have that exciting roll where you beat that other dice that you didn't think you had a chance against.
Yeah, and you do also get to use 2 crit abilities every round. So that's where you're selecting one of your cards, and instead of playing it to follow suit or to start the suit, you're playing it for its special ability. So again, that can help you with like changing your dice values, and they all have different abilities.
Yeah, and those abilities they're all really interesting too, like how different they are, because they're things like you decide to play later in the tricks, which is really interesting. That's the thief, that's his sneaky ability. But there also is just raising up your dice, rolling your dice extra times, making your opponent re-roll their dice. It's just a whole bunch of different stuff, and because you only play with 3 of these each game,
Plus the bard.
plus the bard. That is always, I feel like everything we talk about is plus the bard. But that is always going to change things quite a bit, because you're leaving 2 of those out. And so we've played games where you don't have either of the ones that want the highest. And so now nobody really wants to win anything. And with 2 players, coming second means also going for the lowest. So then it becomes really a race to the bottom.
And speaking of the D&D-ness, this is like using D&D characters, and the art style it feels almost old-timey, like maybe like an old-timey like comic book cover. I don't quite know how to describe it, but it's interesting, it's different.
It's a really cool style. And so that is all of the cards. And then also in the box is the dice, which are going to change. So our dice aren't going to be what the final dice are. And all of the loot, and the loot includes these like weapons and stuff as well that are in there, that are mixed in with the loot.
And you also have the player screens, which serve the function of keeping your dice hidden, but also tell you what the different powers are too.
Yeah, the back of the dice screen is basically your whole rule book and your cheat sheet. I always do enjoy that in a game.
Tug of Roar is a 2-player specific game that has 2 sides, the Lycaron and the Elkyr, trying to take the land. At the start of the game, both players start with 10 captain cards and a wide open map, which is going to be filled over the 3 phases. In the first phase, players enlist their armies by bidding with their captains and choosing one of 2 rows of recruits until they have 12. In the second phase, players deploy those recruits, taking turns to place 1 card at a time in one of the 5 regions. Here, there are a few things to keep in mind. Whoever fills a region first gets a strength bonus. Also, roar values on cards will move a fear track, which can add negatives to the enemies. Also, pairs of cards will provide class bonus abilities in the next phase. And most importantly, whoever has the highest values of cards on their side will win those third phase battles. Once all slots are full on both sides of the map, it is time for the skirmish phase, where players add a captain to each region and then compare strength to see who wins each of those 5 regions, winning flags depending on how much they won by. After all 5 regions have been fought for, the player with the most flags wins, unless there's a tie, in which case you compare the strength of your final remaining captain and then decide the winner.
So one of the cards that you have are your captains, and the captains are really important because you're using them for 2 of the 3 phases, and once you use it, you don't get it back. So you really have to decide when you want to spend your high value captains, because it can be really beneficial to do it in the draft phase to make sure you're getting what you want, but equally as beneficial, if not more so sometimes, to do it like later in the battling phase.
Yeah, and also the tiebreaker one, because in our first games of this, I totally discounted that. I thought, well, that doesn't matter, I'll win in this other phase. But you've only got 5 sections for like a total of, I think, 10 possible points that you're fighting over. And it's one-on-one. So there are decent chances that you are going to tie and are going to come down to that tiebreaker card. And generally, that is going to be a weaker card because I think a lot of people kind of think, well, that's probably not going to come up, and leave that weaker card there. So if you put something strong there and then just manage to tie, that can really be a path to victory. But it is interesting that this game has those 3 different sections, because this reminds me a bit of games like Shot and Totten or even Air, Land, and Sea, Hanamakoji, sorts of games where you're trying to get the majority of your side versus their side, especially in a few different theaters of battle. But because of that drafting phase, this one does play quite a bit different.
Yeah, and you do like all of the drafting at the beginning. It happens over 4 rounds, drafting 3 cards. And sometimes it seems like both rows are pretty equal. And you're like, okay, great, I can just use a low card for this one. Other times it can be quite a big difference. And you really have to be thinking about the future as well, because not only do you want to draft cards that have a high battle value, but you also want to think about what power they may have. And most of the powers only activate if you're playing 2 in a battlefield. So if you're recruiting a card for that power, you want to make sure you get another card as well.
Yeah, you really want to try and draft those in pairs. And you do want to watch what the other person's drafting too. And thankfully, you're doing all of that stuff pretty quickly, so it's not too hard to pay attention to the stuff that they are drafting. But there can definitely be times where you're like, I see that there's a perfect row for them. So either I'm going to go high and try and steal that, or this is a great time just for me to use my 0 card and let them take that and keep my higher cards for the ones that I actually want to compete with them for. I also really like, speaking of the cards, with your captain cards, that they get slightly more dressed as you move from 0 to the top one, which I think is the 9 card or 10, but they get better and better and better as they go, where the 0s are basically naked and the 9s are like full awesome armor.
Yeah, it is slightly asymmetrical because you have the elk and you have the wolves, but the only difference is the elk will win for tiebreakers in the first phase and the wolves will win for tiebreakers in the last phase. So just a small little difference other than like how they look and their clothing. And then once you have drafted all of your cards for phase 2, you take turns placing them out. And so you are seeing where your opponent's going, where you want to go, and the first person who is able to put both of their cards down in one of the battlefields also gets a +2. So you are motivated to fill a battlefield first, but then you're giving the opponent all the information that they might need for that battlefield.
But you don't necessarily have to give all of the information, because there are 3 cards that you can play face down, but you've really got to think about that choice, because you've got cards like the Druid, which lets you move cards or replace cards or take out cards, but only if you play it face up in that second section. But also you want to move that roar meter back and forth, and you can only do that if you're playing cards face up, and that's going to add negatives if you can move it far enough to strike fear into your opponent.
Yeah, and you get to choose where those negatives go as well. So you really want to be trying to push that roar track to your opponents and not get it. So it does motivate you to keep your cards face up. But the decision of which card to play can be tricky, because often when it comes to these like area control type of games, if you realize you're going to lose a battlefield, you think, okay, I won't play like any good cards in this battlefield and I'll save my good cards for the other ones. But for this, it depends on how much you lose by, because if your opponent beats you by 3 or more, they get to put 2 flags down, meaning you still want to be close even if you know you're not going to win.
Yeah, you don't want to get whooped in this, because losing 2 points can really swing things. And we should have already mentioned this really, but the mat is going to be totally different. So right now this is just a prototype mat. They are planning, it says on the Kickstarter page, they're going to have a neoprene mat for the game. So that will be quite a bit nicer.
And it also includes a to-go container, so you can pack it all up and take it with you, where the 5 different areas are represented by cards. So you don't even have to like take the whole book, you just take a deck of cards.
And those cards, again, like all of them, have slightly different art in them. This style is a little bit more kind of comic booky, and I already talked about how much I like that they get more dressed as they go, where the weaker cards are slightly less ready for battle than the stronger cards, and that's just such a neat little touch.
You start Thieves of Eldris with a grid of 24 cards, which makes up Skullduggery Square, and 3 cards in your hand, one of which you will choose to be your cut purse, and the other 2 will become your first targets. On your turn, you roll the dice, then move 1 townsfolk, matching each of the dice you rolled, swapping them with an adjacent card. If 2 of these dice match, you also get a special power that will impact the square in some other devious way. If after moving, this leaves your cut purse next to one of your targets, you can rob them and gain 2 coins if they're in the corners of the square, 1.5 if they're on the outside, or 1 if they're in the middle. The danger of this, though, is if other people can reveal who your cut purse is, they can on their turn move next to you and identify you, taking $1 from you and $2 from the bank. The game continues like this, with players moving, robbing, and maybe revealing each other until someone has gained 8 coins, at which point the game is over, and that player gets to join the Thieves Guild.
So off the top, just to mention that the dice will be upgraded, and the components, I think some of them are getting an upgrade as well. So I know you're going to see pictures of these, so we just wanted to say that first and foremost. But other than that, in terms of how it plays, it is very much a hidden movement deduction game. And as a result, we found that it plays very differently at 2 players compared to 3 or 4 players.
Yeah, at 2 players, I found we played really aggressively. So at 2 players, you can kind of just like let yourself be known and just like rob. And it's kind of like almost a robin race. Because you can sometimes try and kind of hide out on the other side of the board. There are definitely ways to mitigate that, though, because with some of the powers from the dice, you can just warp those people right next to you or move yourself over there. So depending on those dice rolls, you are definitely not safe. But we definitely found that we played a little bit more aggressively. Just a little bit of a different way to play. Whereas at 3 or 4, that hiding out becomes a lot more important, because someone is always going to be able to get you. So you've really got to be a lot more secretive, and there's a lot more turns where you're not actually robbing anybody.
Yeah, because you're trying to keep your identity a little bit secret, whereas if you rob it, you're signaling, hey, it's me, and you're probably going to be less likely to rob the corners, where you're really narrowing it down to 2, unless, again, of course, of those dice rolls, because there is one that lets you rob diagonally, and that can make quite a big difference too. But it is interesting that you'll be a little bit quieter, but also all of the cards are moving more.
Yeah, and it is tough too, because in order to move them too, like you've got 3 moves every time. You kind of have to get the right dice, but also if you've got to move somebody a little bit of a distance, it becomes very obvious which one you're moving. So you do want to spend some turns moving people you don't even care about, just to have people think, well, why is he moving them now? What is he actually over here a little bit? Is that what's going on? Because you definitely need to throw people off the scent, but it's also a race to 8 coins, so you can't dilly-daddle too long about it.
Yeah, and it's quite a bonus if you can accurately identify who the other thief is or the other thieves are, because you get to take one of their coins and you get an initial 2. So a 3-coin bonus is quite a bit, but you do also have to end up next to them. So you are again signaling who you might be by doing that.
Yeah, at 2 players, that is really the tricky part, is that you've got to get next to them. And so we have times where we're getting close, but staying just far enough away that they've got to have all 3 rolls just perfect. So then we can get to them next time without being totally at their mercy that they can catch us right now. But yeah, at 3 or 4, knowing who anyone is, you want to go get them pretty much right away, but you want to make sure that after you get them, the next person can't just jump immediately on you as well. So you still do want to be a little bit sneaky.
And you want to make sure you're right, because if you're wrong, you just reveal who you are and you get no bonus. So it is quite a risk. So it's big payoff, but big risk. And it also comes with a to-go container and scoring cards that you can use to keep track of all of the coins instead of using the coins. So instead of taking the full book, you can just take it as a deck of cards.
And the art style in this one is a little bit more reminiscent of what I think of as kind of traditional D&D. Like I would expect this in one of the actual like D&D rule books. And it also has these really shiny backs. These shiny backs are across all of it. The shiny backs are on the half of the cards that you're using as your thieves, which are called in this cut purses, which I really like. I love the old timiness of that they're cut purses, and you have the nick phase, which is when you're actually stealing things. I love the terminology. But the backs of those are all really shiny. That's across the board, and I really like those shiny backs.
Yeah, the shiny backs are great, and they're also on all of the books as well.
And that is it. That is Tales of the Twisted Realms. All 3 games, and all of those are on Kickstarter right now. And just a reminder, this is a paid Kickstarter preview.
And we'll put the link to the Kickstarter page in the description, and the Kickstarter is running until the 7th of March. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another game.